I'm Professor Laurence Jones at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and I'd like to welcome you to this event. It's the second in a new series from the Natural Capital Initiative, and the NCI is a partnership between three leading scientific organisations in the UK: Royal Society of Biology, the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and the James Hutton Institute. So the mission of NCI is to support the decision-making that results in sustainable management of our natural capital. And the topic of the session today is around marine natural capital. So there's a lot of interest in this, both from academics wanting to provide robust science to underpin our assessments of natural capital, and then obviously a lot of interest from businesses wanting to invest in carbon credits and businesses wanting to provide a service to do that. So we've got three great speakers this morning, and I will introduce them shortly. So just some protocols. So while the talks are going on, if you've got any questions, just put them in the Q&A and put your name as well so that we know who the questions come from. And we'll save the questions until after all three speakers have given their talks, and there'll be a sort of 30 to 40-minute Q&A session at the end. So if you can put your name, and if you've got the question addressed to a particular person, put that in the question as well. You can tweet during the session. So Ellie, thank you, has put the details there. So I think that's it on the overview. So I will now introduce Annette. So Annette will be our first speaker. Annette Burden is going to be talking about the UK Salt Marsh Code. Annette is a wetland biogeochemist and blue carbon lead at UKCEH. She also leads a consortium developing the UK Salt Marsh Code, and she advises UK government on how to recognise the climate change mitigation potential of coastal habitats. So that involves developing the scientific knowledge base through primary research so that you can include salt marsh in the UK greenhouse gas inventory. She has expertise of developing methods and models to predict carbon benefit of restoration over time, and the monitoring programs that we need to provide robust evidence-grade data. And she has a particular interest in the effects of climate change and land use change on the coastal environment, connectivity between coastal habitats, inland and marine influences. So I will hand over to Annette now, if you can share your slides and start when you're ready.
Great, thank you very much. So just before I share my slides, I just want to say, as Laurence said, I'm going to be talking about the Salt Marsh Code and what that is and what it kind of means, what the significance of it is. But first, just so we're all on the same page, a salt marsh, it's a coastal habitat at the edge of land and sea. It's an ever-changing landscape with wide-ranging salinity, temperature, tidal and water flow regimes, things like that. And there's a lot of pressures on these habitats from climate change impacts, like the effects of increased storminess, and then also kind of man-made changes as well, and management. And they've been kind of depicted in the past as quite wild and dangerous and lawless places, but thankfully we see them as much more than that now. And they are very beautiful. They're great places to be when the sea lavender's all in flower, and you can see marsh harriers sweeping around and things like that, and they're very charismatic places. But not only that, salt marshes provide many services to society, ecosystem services, so this adds to the importance of them. And then it means that there isn't just kind of an intrinsic value of these habitats, you can also put kind of a monetary value on them as well. So I'll just share my screen with you all. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you about the Salt Marsh Code. So the Salt Marsh Code is going to be designed to be used within the voluntary carbon market. So the voluntary carbon market is where carbon credits are purchased by organisations or investors for voluntary use. So it's not anything to do with legally binding emissions reductions or obligations or anything like that. Completely voluntary. And the Saltmarsh Code will be this voluntary certification standard to attract private funding for restoration projects in exchange for these climate benefits. So the code provides this pipeline between investment and project delivery. And it will be an evidence-based approach, providing assurances to buyers that climate benefits are real, quantifiable, additional and permanent. And these 4 things are really essential for the codes and to have confidence in the market. So within the UK, we have 2 domestic codes. So we have the Woodland Code and the Peatland Code at the moment. Woodland Code was launched over 10 years ago now. Peatland Code is about 8 years old. And between them, about 1.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents have been validated. So kind of carbon units within the market. And there's been a big growth within this market over the last few years, especially for the Woodland Code. But the Peatland Code has been increasing over this last year as well. Another important thing that's happening within the UK market at the moment is this BSI project, drawing on the government's policy framework for nature markets. So it's the Nature Investment Standards Programme. And this is sponsored by DEFRA. It was launched this year. And it's to support the UK nature markets, not just carbon, but nature markets in general, to demonstrate high integrity and create overarching principles and standards that all codes, existing and new codes that come along, will kind of fit underneath. There's also international initiatives with movement in that kind of space at the moment as well. And all of the kind of international kind of new advice and everything will be considered within this BSI project. Other key developing areas within the UK nature markets are investigating whether you can have more than one type of credit or unit issued for different ecosystem services on the same piece of land. And this would be through stacking and bundling. I won't go into it much now, but we're looking at that as to whether you could look at carbon and, say, biodiversity or flood risk management at the same time on the same site. Now, I wanted to mention the greenhouse gas inventory. The voluntary carbon market is voluntary, as I said, but there is also a way that we account for our greenhouse gas emissions in the UK and worldwide that is a legal requirement. So this is required under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it satisfies our obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. And it's also, the greenhouse gas inventory is also used for setting our domestic carbon budgets under the UK Climate Change Act and also in the devolved administrations. And coastal habitats would fit under the land use change and forestry section, and there is guidance as to how to include them. And peatlands were included in the last couple of years, so it's kind of set a precedent for coastal wetlands to be included, including saltmarsh. And there's also nationally determined contributions, which is the national plan for how we're going to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. And it's a legal requirement to produce it, but it's a non-binding plan. And coastal habitats are currently listed within coastal adaptation, but not mitigation in the UK. So the kind of principles of them are kind of the same, really. The commonality is they both seek to determine the emissions removal that occurs as a result of the land use change or the management. So it's basically this kind of measurement of what's happening with carbon times by the activity data, so the area, and you get this emissions or removal. But they are different in terms of like scale, with the Saltmarsh Code being designed for application at a project level, as opposed to the greenhouse gas inventory is kind of an overall of the UK. And UKCH are also working on this potential implementation of the greenhouse gas inventory for saltmarsh habitat. And the reason I mention that is because both the code and the greenhouse gas inventory will draw upon the same empirical evidence base. And when we're developing the code, we're also looking at what the greenhouse gas inventory needs so that we have a consistency approach and we develop them both at the same time. So why develop a saltmarsh code? So there's the current extent of saltmarsh in the UK is nowhere near what it would have been. It's very hard to know what the exact amount of saltmarsh would have been before land reclamation and stuff had started. But in the kind of post-war period, there's been about 15% loss. And that kind of continues in due to pressures like sea level rise and storminess. But restoration has started in the UK. There's been about 3,000 hectares of restoration projects so far. with the motivation behind that being kind of compensatory habitat or flood risk management. And in a way, I don't really want to add kind of having carbon units as a list of the reasons why, or the motivation to restore salt marsh. We kind of should be doing it because it's the great and responsible thing to do. But and it's because of all these many benefits that this diagram shows here. So it's not just about carbon, it's about everything else. It's the biodiversity, the cultural, water purification, denitrification, fisheries, all of these things that come together. And we should keep an eye on this. The carbon is just is a great way of getting money into restoration projects because it's the most developed market, and the public purse just isn't large enough to be able to pay for all the restoration that we want to do. So developing that pipeline using the voluntary carbon market means that we'll be able to do more restoration quicker. And because of all the benefits salt marsh habitat, salt marsh restoration creates, it kind of delivers to various policies. So, for example, here, the 25-year Environment Plan, Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management, the Environment Act, there are others as well, shoreline management planning. So by restoring the salt marsh, it's not just about the carbon, it's about everything else that they do as well. So when you're developing a code, there's lots of different things to consider, especially when a code, it kind of doesn't exist yet. So there's lots of things that you have to put in place. Now, I'm a scientist, so I tend to think about this first box, the science box, but there are lots of other things. So from a science point of view, we need to make sure that we know enough, basically. Do we have enough data, and is it good enough to be able to predict how much carbon gain or loss there will be over time? And when we say over time, we think of in kind of 100-year timescales. So we need that ability to be able to predict what will happen in the future. And we also need a way to monitor, report and verify, so MRV, so the carbon benefit of a project. And we need to consider the kind of cost effectiveness of that because we need to make this investable, and all the skills needed. So the MRV needs to be developed for the code to work. There's also things like key components like rules you have to deal with. So one of these being the applicability. So is the restoration activity or the management activity within the remit of the code? So at the moment, while we've been developing the salt marsh code, we are only looking at managed realignment of salt marshes. So managed realignment is where you basically usually build a new sea defence further inland, and then you knock a hole in the current sea defence and let that area of land flood with the tide. And that's the only management activity we're looking at, or restoration activity, with the view that in the future other ones could be added into the code afterwards. But with managed realignment, it's where we've got the most data and we know the most about what happens over time. You have to think about the baseline. So it's not just the baseline kind of now, it's what the baseline would be in the future, and all the kind of carbon benefit of the restoration is always compared back to this baseline. So if your baseline would have been capturing more carbon in time, then you have to kind of knock that off the amount of carbon that your project means that you've kind of stored as well. There's various other things like additionality, permanence of the carbon, leakage, and what carbon can be included and what can't, which is quite an important aspect of coastal codes. You've got carbon that originates from within the site. So that is truly due to the management activity or restoration activity that the project that you've done. But then you have carbon coming in from outside. And there's rules around whether that can be counted or not, because it's not necessarily to do with your restoration project. And then there's all the governance side of it. So who will manage the code? How will credits be issued and tracked and transferred? Are we going to sell pending issuance units? The Peatland Code do this. So this is where a kind of carbon credit that you have predicted will happen in the future, but hasn't actually been captured yet. So do you sell those now, or do you only sell verified carbon units, which is when we know that it is within the site? So lots to do there. And then there's the whole validation and verification process with validation and verification bodies. Who will these be? What will the cycle be? Within the Peatland Code, it's every 5 years, and what the protocol for that will be. So that goes back to this kind of MRV component. And then you have to understand all the kind of investment side, which isn't my part of the project, so I can try and answer questions. But you need to understand the revenue potential, have really good estimated costs to be able to develop this financial model. And then it's a continuous process of development. The code will have like a management board of it that will look after it, and they'll continually look at improvements and other things that can be brought into the code. And then you do have this continued improvement. It's not just kind of a static set of instructions. They will constantly change. So the UK Salt Marsh Code project as a whole, specifically, the project team is a consortium. I'm here representing all of them. It's a big group effort. So they include scientists, conservation delivery, investment finance experts. All their logos are there on the slide. There's 9 organisations involved. And then the project so far, we had our first phase of the project started in 2021, where we did a lot of evidence gathering, feasibility study, recommendations for a UK code, etc. I'll say a bit more about that next. And then we're now into kind of phase 2 of the project, which is split into 2 parts, where we're drafting the code and then we'll be refining it. So we'll draft the code. That will take us to about spring, summer of 24. And then there'll be about a year where we'll be refining it. So from phase 1, we did a feasibility study. So we looked at lots of codes, lots of international codes, because we thought, well, if there's a code already out there that can work, then, you know, potentially we could use that. So we looked at all of them, and then we took the VERA code, or the VCS code, methodology for tidal wetland and seagrass restoration, and did a feasibility study. Would this work in the UK? And from a scientific point of view, we thought, yes, it is appropriate. It allows for UK specific estimates and to use the most appropriate method to match available data and things like that. However, from a commercial point of view, it wasn't viable. It's a really high upfront cost to the projects compared to what we estimated a domestic code would be based on costs of the peatland and woodland code. And we did show that UK code, based on those estimated costs, would generate market returns, but not just from carbon alone, but using a blended approach to the finance with capital operational grants. But we did show that it would work. So we recommended developing a UK domestic salt marsh code, which is the kind of second report from that phase 1 part of the project, and both of those reports will be available very soon. And then we also did 2 reviews of the literature within that first phase. And it just shows some kind of issues or considerations we need to take into when we're developing the UK code. One of it, which is there is limited data, although this is changing. There's a lot more data coming on board over the last couple of years and within the next few years to come. And especially on greenhouse gases and kind of restored sites, there's 6 times more data on natural marshes than restored sites. And most of the restored sites are monitored for, say, 5 years, but then there isn't any data after that point. You know, there's restored sites through management alignment now that are kind of 30 years old, but not really any monitoring after that first kind of 5-year period. So it's very hard to know what happens to these sites in the future. There's things like a lack of metadata. We would like to be able to develop models or what happens to these sites over time, but we need that kind of information. And then there's also things like inconsistent terminology and monitoring methodologies. So it makes it difficult for the data to be synthesized, but things like monitoring methodologies are coming along now, and we feel it will be more standardized in the future. So the phase 2 project, phase 2 of the project, the draft in the code is in 3 objectives. So it's the science, the code design, the management and governance. And this is basically just us writing everything that needs to be done to make the code work. So this is including, as I said, the MRV monitoring, reporting and verification, all the kind of tools that we need for the code to work, like risk tools, how we quantify carbon, things like construction and maintenance emissions, how we estimate those, and then everything to do with how it is managed, things like who the host is, registry, etc., things that I've already mentioned. And then we'll go into kind of the second part of that, where we'll be refining it. And it depends mostly on what progress we may make as to what will be included in this. But one big thing will be the market assessment that was carried out and that will be followed on with further development of the business case and financial model. So all the decisions we make about the registry we use and insurance and things like that will all feed into this, so that we can ensure the business model is as appropriate as possible and that the code is self-sustaining into the future and can be used for as long as possible.
A couple more minutes.
So thank you.
Oh, you finished. Perfect.
I have. So yeah, so just on behalf of the whole team, as I said, it's not just me, but thank you for asking me to come along and talk about the code, and yeah, get in touch if anybody wants any more information. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Thank you very much, Annette, for that very clear presentation. So we've got we've got one question so far in the Q&A, so please add some more questions as you think of them. So I will now move over to introduce Taco. So Taco van Heusden is co-founder of the KALY group, and he's going to be talking about marine natural capital markets. So Taco is a seasoned corporate financier, hotel and real estate investor and developer. He's passionate about the hospitality business. He initially embarked on an operational career in the industry that's taken him all around the world to Germany, Belgium, China. He then returned to university and subsequently moved to London, where he started at UBS Warburg as an investment banker, and then transitioned into the world of real estate private equity, where he worked for companies such as Soros Real Estate and Strategic Value Partners. He's worked extensively with institutional investors, family offices in Europe and the Middle East as a transactional and operating partner in both hospitality and real estate. Post-pandemic, Taco has made it his aim to leave the world a better place for his children, and to achieve that, he's co-founded the KALY Group, which is a nature-based sustainable infrastructure platform. So over to you, Taco, and share your slides when you're ready. You're on mute at the moment.
Sorry, thank you very much, Laurence. Let me share my slides, and hopefully everybody can see the slides right
that's
now.
Perfect. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So, indeed, my entry into the world of natural capital is fairly new. 2 years, as a matter of fact. We started the KALY group on the Isle of Skye with a group of friends and people who later came around in our, who we met, who come from a very diverse background. So we have corporate financiers mixed with fishermen, mixed with seaweed farmers, impact investors, and we have set ourselves the task of creating a company that works for both the environment, shareholders, and local communities in equal measure. We do that really by focusing on two things. One is an integrated seaweed farming industry, which is not part of the discussion today, and the other one is trying to understand how we can help facilitate and after that participate in a marine natural capital market. We were founded in January 2022. We are funded by Scottish Enterprise and a group of Scottish investors. And the reason, I guess, why we are here today is because together with the James Hutton Institute and the Scottish Association for Marine Science, we were the recipient 2 months ago of a FERNS grant. And for those who don't know FERNS, that is the facility for investment ready, the facility for investment readiness in nature in Scotland. And with that, we set ourselves the task of finding a practical way in which we as a business, with at the end of the day, multiple aims, but of course also a commercial aim, could find a way to practically implement a marine natural capital project and bring private finance into this world. And to do so, we have focused on three main areas. One is community outreach and involvement. How do you ensure that the communities in which you are operating are happy with your activities? And that is not necessarily a straightforward issue. MRV, measurement, reporting, verification, incredibly important. I won't spend too much time on it today because I'm not the scientist, and there are other people on the panel today who are far more qualified to talk about MRV than I am. And the last thing is really contractual arrangements with investors, credit buyers, owners of the seabed, and various other parties that come with it. The great thing for us is that there's a lot of ongoing initiatives currently in the market. Some of them have already been mentioned this morning. As others are speaking today at the panel, so I won't spend too much time on it. For us, really, the British Standards Institute on the codification of ecosystem services on behalf of DEFRA is key, because we feel that at the end of the day, unless ecosystem services receive a regulatory framework that is part of law, or the law of the country, these markets will not really take off, because we have to move away from purely voluntary markets to markets that are, just like you need to pay for water discharge, you should also pay for ecosystem services that you use on a daily basis. So that's great news that the British Standards Institute is working on that. The barriers that we see, and this is a very generic overview of what we think needs to happen in order to really create a marine natural capital market. On the far left-hand side, acceptance by local communities of activities. That is important because although all of us think that we are doing great and necessary work, there are other peoples, especially in the marine environment, who use the marine environment, who use the environment, the marine environment for a living, and they have sometimes competing interests to what we have. The two on the right, a lot of time has been spent on this by the scientific community, the harmonization of biodiversity, of carbon credits, understanding how the MRV works. How do you ensure transparency and verifiability? Also, a lot of work has been spent on what we feel at the moment the biggest gap sits in the conversion of natural assets into financial capital and the definition of a legal framework around it. And no matter how unpalatable it sounds to convert nature into financial capital instruments and legal frameworks, it is something that is necessary to to make this market take off. And I think the easiest way to compare it is if you compare it to the terrestrial environment. It is relatively straightforward. If you own a piece of land and you plant a tree on it, then you own that tree, and you can therefore decide to sell a carbon credit that comes out of the tree, and nobody will bother you. In the marine environment, it is more complicated because depending on where you are, and there's lots of nuance here, but the seabed is generally owned by the Crown Estate. The water column, however, above it, where marine natural capital will take place, is not owned by the Crown Estate, and certain species, for instance, the oyster, are owned by the Scottish government, and I should say native oysters, and of course not farmed oysters, but native oysters are owned by the Scottish government, and it is not immediately possible to sell an ecosystem service out of, for instance, an oyster, if you don't actually own the oyster. So there's I'll spend the rest of the presentation really talking about questions that we have at the moment, and it's probably because we are only 2 months into our grant, and only a year into thinking about these things, and we probably have at the moment more questions than answers in terms of practical implementation of a process where investors and businesses can actually make this work. And I will just pick a few questions out there. One simple first one is, if large-scale funding becomes available, will locals actually be interested in putting that funding to work? At the moment, of course, it's very much a volunteer effort that happens on weekends. But of course, if suddenly somebody would receive £10 million for a project, that may entail people taking full-time positions to do what is sometimes quite hard work in harsh environments on a long-term basis. Are these people there? How do you reward the community? A lot of time has been spent speaking about, community rewards. But how are these rewards administered? Who is the right person to receive administration? Should we to receive benefits? Should we, as a developer, provide money to a local charity, to a local development corporation, to the local authority? Should we just allow ourselves to be taxed by the Scottish government and then they will distribute the money? We don't know yet how that in practice would work. Another one that is a pernicious problem, and the speaker before me also previously touched on it. These projects need to provide ecosystem services for years to come, for 100 years. How do we make sure that 57 years from now, that ecosystem service that I sold on day one is actually still there and is producing, that ecosystem service? How do I set up a system where I can genuinely, promise to an investor on day one that we will take care of it for the next 100 years, even if I know that, well, I will not be around, but as life goes, it is possible that KALY Group wouldn't be around. Who would be the right person, who will be around in 100 years to supervise that my initial promise of taking care of the environment for 20, 30, 100 years, I will actually be able to fulfill that promise? And if I found that person, how do we make sure that that person receives the money to do so. The legal questions to answer, the biggest legal question for us to answer currently, but it's because we are focusing on, on oysters on day one, is the Scottish government willing to, or willing and or able to participate in a legal structure where we are allowed to sell off ecosystem services of oysters that we create. So the interesting situation is we hatch an oyster, and as soon as we put it into the water, the ownership of that oyster has been lost to the Scottish government, which is, of course, from an investment perspective, a difficult situation to make that work. So that is, one of the items that we're working on with the Scottish government, and of course, with these things, politics come into play, and the question is also, politically speaking, if then the privatization of nature, as some would call it, is palatable to the electorate, which is not a foregone conclusion. That is something that is politically possible to do. Touched on it previously. What happens if in 60 years' time the manager who is supposed to take care of the oysters doesn't do his a good enough job? Who would we allow us? Who would we allow? Who would we provide the authority to sack ourselves? Because that would be necessary if you want to have a genuinely long-term management of the marine environment. Certification, of course, of projects, has been discussed previously by the speaker before me in terms of codes or in terms of VERA. Is it necessary for project developers to be certified? So not just the project itself, but also the companies, who provide that service. It's another question that we are, wondering what the answer to this is. We have questions around whether credits are actually the appropriate form to sell ecosystem services, and current thinking is that possibly credits are actually an inadequate way of selling ecosystem services, because inevitably, as soon as we sell an ecosystem service, the buyer, a credit, that buyer will inevitably say, well, here you've got your money, thank you very much. I have done my bit and I have bought the service, but whether that service then is actually there for the next 100 years, the buyer will care less about it, because he believes that he has already done his job. And if markets proceed as we think they will proceed, this could become an international market, and the buyer of that credit may be in Australia, in New York, or in Saudi Arabia, and I will never find that person anymore if I've got a problem, or if I need cash to continue providing the ecosystem services that I have promised. The incorporation of credits into the regulatory environment we've touched on, that is, the British Standards Institute, which hopefully will provide that route into the legal system.
A couple more minutes, Taco.
Yeah, exactly. I've got one more slide after this. One other pernicious problem, of course, where we are struggling with, but that is a very long and heated discussion, is about greenwashing. Whether we as project developers should, or how, sorry, not whether we should care, because we will care, but how do we determine what money is labeled to be greenwashing, and what money is not labeled to be greenwashing. Where do you draw the line between what is a cynical attempt of the buyer to stay in business as usual, and where it is a genuine wish from the buyer to transition its efforts into a more sustainable business over the next 10 or 15 years. Last questions that we still have, where is possibly easier to answer, but still a subject of debate. Ecosystem services is not yet established science, on all aspects, and particularly one has to keep in mind that marine natural capital market, or marine natural capital, is of course an incredibly wide description label to put on 2/3 of the world. If we would think that we would create a code for the entire terrestrial world, people would quite quickly see that is just too big of a scope. So the question whether it is realistic to put a scope on all of the marine environment, or if it needs to be more divided into smaller units. We also have questions on what should we sell? Do we sell oysters, hectares of sequestration and enhancement, or areas, or simple amounts of carbon sequestration? And I guess in summary, for us, there's still a lot of questions around the practical implementation of a marine natural capital market. We're optimistic, though, that we will get answers. There's a lot of very smart people working on it around the community, and hopefully, if we have this chat again in another 12 to 24 months, we will have found a way in which we can actually get our first project off the ground. And that project won't be perfect in all aspects, but we believe it's probably best to just get going and make it perfect as we go along. And I will stop here for a minute.
Thank you very much, Taco. Very thoughtful talk with lots of questions about how you actually implement these things in practice. We've got a good few questions coming in the Q&A, so thank you. Keep those coming. So let's move to our third speaker of the morning. So Maddie Millington-Drake is a senior climate project manager at the Blue Marine Foundation, and she's talking about developing a high-integrity marine natural capital market in the UK. Maddie is the senior climate project manager in Blue Marine's climate unit. She joined in May 22, and after working in sustainable land use development in Gabon, focusing on conservation and terrestrial carbon markets. Maddie works on projects around ocean climate policy, marine natural capital markets, and the fair inclusion of local communities in blue carbon projects. And she's contributed to a variety of papers on these topics. She holds an MSc in environmental change and management from University of Oxford. So welcome, Maddie, and over to you to share your slides and start when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Is that working?
Yep, that's perfect.
Great. Morning, everyone. Thank you, Taco and Annette. I will be building on a lot of what you both have already said, so it's very handy for me. I'm going to be just talking about one specific project that Blue Marine Foundation are working on in partnership with all the logos that you can see here. So in partnership with the Crown Estate and Crown Estate Scotland, and the work is being delivered by Pollination and Finance Earth. And we are developing a roadmap for what a high integrity marine natural capital market in the UK might look like. So really building on a lot of what Taco's just already discussed. But first, a little bit about Blue Marine. Blue Marine is a UK-based charity. Our mission is to see at least 30% of the world's ocean protected by 2030 and the remaining 70% managed in a responsible way. Although we're a UK-based charity, we work in over 40 projects across the globe, from the Maldives to Namibia, and working across sort of fisheries, MPA protection, also education, investigations, and other areas. So on to the work in the UK, and specifically the marine natural capital work. So the UK has an opportunity to, sort of building on what Annette has discussed in terms of domestic codes. We see that the UK has an opportunity to set a benchmark for an equitable, transparent and high integrity market. So with funding from ourselves, Crown Estate Scotland, the Crown Estate and Esme Fairbairn Foundation, Finance, Earth and Pollination are leading this initiative. But just sort of zooming out a little bit, the UK's blue economy is estimated to be around 47 billion and represents around 500,000 jobs. And natural capital markets are really, or sort of a high integrity market, is really a way to fulfill really a way to help sort of achieve publicly determined goals, but also sort of to help restore and see the health and function of our marine ecosystems in perpetuity for sustainable long-term development and restoration of those ecosystems. And it's where sort of public finance might alone not be enough to achieve those goals, which is where private investment is really important and where these sort of voluntary markets can help establish that. Annette's already touched on it, but this market will be sort of voluntary, like the Woodland and the Peatland Code, but then there are also compliance markets within the UK currently. Well, specifically in England, there's Biodiversity Net Gain Scheme, and then also Natural England's Nutrient Neutrality Scheme as well. So those are sort of compliance, and then the voluntary market, as Annette said, will hold maybe the Salt Marsh Code and potentially the Seagrass Code in the future. So the roadmap, as I said, is in sort of the first phase. The first phase report was published in September, and I'll touch on that in a bit more detail around our initial findings. And we're into the second phase, which has involved a public consultation at the beginning. And we're now going to be refining the initial report to really produce something that doesn't concentrate on the barriers, but concentrates on the recommendations and hopefully the solutions to what those barriers are. The team have to date engaged around nearly 100 stakeholders in both online workshops, but also in-person one-on-one interviews and in-person workshops. And the vision for kind of the roadmap as a whole is to incentivize high integrity projects that are based on robust and up-to-date science, that have fair inclusion and transparent inclusion of local stakeholders. And that point underpins the entire kind of roadmap and the work, and Taco went into a great detail around community engagement. So I won't focus on that now, but it sort of underpins everything and all of the barriers and solutions that I'll touch on. And also that the first phase sort of looked desk-based, but also stakeholder engagement of UK-wide. And the second phase is really drilling down into the devolved nations and what are the key priorities and also potentially solutions that are more applicable for Wales, for Scotland, for Northern Ireland, for England. And really kind of trying to understand how those can, what synergies there are, but then also where we may need to concentrate on a different angle, or how we can engage certain stakeholders in certain locations, and really try to drill down into the fact that maybe some areas are not applicable to others as sort of a UK picture. So the initial findings of the report, so I won't go into too much detail of each of the barriers, but we've split them into sort of 3 key pillars, but goes without saying that all of these are very cross-cutting, cross-sectoral, but sort of the three pillars are easier to digest all of the information. So finance, science and policy. And also, again, these barriers are UK-wide, so not nation-specific. And you can see a lot of them correspond to what Taco touched on. So finance, revenue stream challenges, science around needed more sort of evidence gaps filled, and then policy, demand drivers, marine spatial planning, government resources and capacity building. So if we drill down into the finance section, you'll see there is a series of recommendations, and these are sort of our first set of recommendations. And in the second phase, we'll be sort of prioritizing these and understanding which stakeholders can play key roles within the recommendations and the solutions. And also, again, trying to understand if these are suitable for each nation, but also what are the timeframes of these? Are some more suitable for short-term thinking in the next year or so, or are some sort of 5 years down the line? And so really trying to sort of order them, prioritize them. Science, exactly the same setup. Recommendations around linking up with the UK Blue Carbon Evidence Partnership, who launched their evidence needs statement in July this year, and working with them to understand how those evidence gaps can be filled, who is working on which evidence gaps, so to try and create stakeholder cohesion and understand what everyone's doing. Blue Marine was also part of launching the UK Blue Carbon Forum back in the end of 2021 alongside WWF, RSPB and the Wildlife Trust, and sort of using those platforms to, again, try to all work together to achieve these aims. And then policy, again, a lot of policy ones, so it's quite a heavy one, but working with different governments, different sort of sectors of the government, and again in each devolved nation to understand their priorities, what policies fit where, looking at things like the NDC, like the GHG inventory, what those plans are, looking longer term to sort of the next set of NDCs in 2025, and then also working with the Crown Estate and other key stakeholders on integrated marine spatial planning, on trying to have sort of marine natural capital recognised within that planning process, and how we can streamline that process for project developers and other kind of key questions like that. So the next steps, which I've already touched on, so consultations happened, but if I think Ellie may have put the report in the chat, so if you haven't seen it and would like to provide feedback, the consultation's closed, but please do, you can either email me with any feedback or Will at Finance Earth. Written feedback, absolutely fine. There was a Google form, but if you want to take the time and put it in an email, it'd be really appreciated. And as I've said, sort of the key, what we wanted to really understand was, have we missed anything? Have we kind of highlighted the right key barriers? Do people agree with those? And do people agree with the recommendations? Again, have we missed any key recommendations? Are actually some of those recommendations really actions within the recommendation, and sort of like drawing things out like that, drawing out that kind of higher level of detail? We are then conducting some more in-person workshops. The first has already happened, which was in Cardiff, and then we've got England, we've got London, and then Belfast and Edinburgh at the beginning of next year. And again, really trying to understand which stakeholders need to be involved where are the issues, where are the solutions, and also kind of how can we, in terms of prioritizing the recommendations, understand the complexity of those, and also the cost, and who could contribute financially to which recommendation, and sort of then putting it all together. So hopefully we'll answer some of Taco's questions that you brought up, and also look at sort of the codes and how they're all going to fit together, as Annette already touched on. So thank you very much. And yes, if you have any questions or would like to to feedback on the report, please do email me. It'd be greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much, Maddie. Again, a nice overview of the challenges. So we've heard three very different perspectives. And we've got a few questions in the chat. So I'll sort of move around a little bit between them. I'll start with a question to Annette from Kerry Whalen. So Kerry's asking for a bit more explanation about pending issuance units and the pros and cons of incorporating them in the Saltmarsh Code.
Okay, so a pending, there are two types of kind of units that could be sold. So pending issuance units are it is basically a carbon unit that hasn't been realised yet through the project, but it is predicted to be in time. So you would have your prediction of what's going to happen with how many carbon units you're going to have over time from a project, and it's whether you sell them either kind of upfront or you kind of wait for them to be validated. So there's validated units as well, which is once that carbon credit is actually kind of there, that's your validated unit. So the Peatland Code kind of sells both. Pending issuance units tend to be a bit cheaper because I guess there's a bit more risk around it. So that's kind of like but the pros of it is you get more money in quicker, so that you can kind of pay for more restoration or the upkeep of the site or things like that. So it just goes back to kind of the financial model. The thing with kind of the validation process is, say for the Peatland Code, you have your validation of the project, and then your first verification is 5 years down the line. So that would mean if you don't sell pending issuance units, you can't sell anything for 5 years. So it's something we need to think about in the Saltmarsh Code, whether we would sell them or not. And we don't know what our process of verification will be, or whether it will be 5 years or we could verify some within 2 years, say, and then that would totally change the financial model.
Thank you, Annette. I think that was clear. Let's move to a question to Taco. So a question from Bruce Howard, and he says, if a marine natural capital project such as seaweed farming is centered on delivering community benefit, e.g. through a community benefit society, will that make equity or debt finance impossible? And how would those sort of projects start, through philanthropy grants, for example?
For us, seaweed farming it needs to become a purely commercial business. I think you need to separate between seaweed farming and seaweed forestry, which is on the seabeds and which could provide an ecosystem service. So seaweed farming, we think is commercially viable, so with debt and equity financing, but that's a different topic, probably for a different chat, which is going to take another 1 or 2 years before we're at that point. Community, the fact that if you put it on other marine capital projects, so say an oyster restoration project, that is going to be the challenge. That yes, it does need to be able to be debt and equity financed, and even though it provides community benefits. And we think we've got some answers to it, and hopefully by the time that our Friends Grant has ended in March, we will be able to provide a blueprint, and really with the word a, is not the blueprint, but a way in which we could possibly marry all those things up together.
Thank you, Taco. As a question that's perhaps a bit more general, but I don't know if Maddie wants to pick on it first, or feel free to pass it to someone else. So the question is about UK compliance markets around nutrient neutrality. So all nutrient mitigation markets so far are terrestrially based. What are the prospects for developing marine-based nutrient mitigations that fit within this framework? And what would be the first steps to including marine schemes within this market?
big question. I may pass on, but in terms of kind of nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain, and then marine net gain in terms of compliance, marine net gains consultation, public consultation closed last September, and we're still sort of waiting to find out what that might look like and how that therefore might engage with England's biodiversity net gain. In terms of nutrient neutrality, I don't actually work on that as closely, so Annette and Taco might know a bit more than me, but for biodiversity net gain in England, salt marsh and seagrass are included, but very specific activities in terms of restoration and then managed realignment. And so I'm unsure what marine net gain might look like, and if it might go into what it's going to look like in terms of intertidal and subtidal ecosystems. But I may leave it there and pass to Annette if you know more about in terms of nutrient neutrality in the code and how they might interact.
Yeah, so there is scope for say salt marshes to be included within nutrient neutrality. So we're working on that now. So the idea being that if you restored or created a salt marsh in an area that you've got flow from a river, it would create that kind of ecosystem service for you by holding on to those nutrients and cleaning the water basically. But the challenge is in there isn't a huge amount of data around it, so there's nothing to stop having kind of nutrient units within the code. We called it a salt marsh code for a reason, not a carbon code, because once it's there and it's set up, you could bolt on other things like this quite easily. But it's the challenges in the data and being able to predict what happens and being able to develop those kind of monitoring methods for it. And also, so you know that it's commercially viable. You need to know what happens in the future as to whether it's going to be commercially viable or not. But we are kind of working on it and kind of developing the evidence at the moment and looking at what evidence is out there.
Yeah, if I could possibly just add one thing to it, I think the current issue sits in the mitigation hierarchy, where Natural England insist that nutrient neutrality solutions are delivered as close as to the source of the pollution as possible, and that obviously has caused an awful lot of trouble lately, of course, with the pooled and then not pooled nutrient neutrality regulations. As soon as I think, or I hope, some pragmatism around the mitigation hierarchy gets recognized by Natural England and other parties, that could definitely become a place for whether it's salt marshes or seaweed farming, which is also a great sequesterer of nutrients, to really become a market in the future.
And if I could just add one more perspective, that for some habitats, excess nutrients start to become a problem. So salt marsh is reasonably good at processing nutrients, and it's part of an open system with the sea. But salt marsh also has tolerances. So there is a critical load defined for the amount of nitrogen inputs that salt marsh can, I guess, process internally before it starts to affect the community composition of the plant communities. So there are potential damage implications as well for having too many nutrients input to some systems. Okay, so let's move on to another question. So a question from Sheila Haymans, and this is a question to all of you again. So how do you plan to take the impact of climate change on these systems into account? So they've done a document on blue carbon, and that was one of the key issues they found with using blue carbon. So thinking about issues, I guess, like, potential acute events, so pathogens affecting oysters, for example, storms, massive coastal erosion. I don't know who wants to go first on that. Taco?
well, partially, I think the only thing you can do is create a robust system to deal with these eventualities. I mean, we can't plan for something that we can't control because there's no point to waste your time on that. But what you can do, indeed, and that is, I think, is key, and that's where, in my view, credits may be a flawed instrument, is that you need to set up high integrity natural capital markets for the marine environment in a way that ensures positive outcomes for the next 50 to 100 years. And that is only possible if there is a manager in place to make sure that that happens for the next 50 years. And that is something that we're focused on figuring out. How do you put that manager in place to deal with these types of issues in the future?
I can add to that. So, sorry, Maddie.
No, you go.
So for the Saltmarsh Coast specifically, things like sea level rise has to be taken into account. So that is part of the project design documentation. Within the project design documentation, you've also got kind of risk evaluation. So things like the effect of kind of storminess and things like that. We'd look at models that are predicting that into the future and how that could affect sites. And projects wouldn't be allowed to enter the code if they were really risky. If there was something that showed that we can't predict everything, but if there was something that showed, if it was on a really exposed coast, the chances of it having a lot of storm damage, it might not even enter the code to begin with. So you wouldn't be able to sell those credits. There's also building in a buffer of credits, so there'll be a certain amount of carbon credits within the code that will never get sold, and that will be up to about 20% of the credits, so that if something does happen to a project, those kind of credits that have been sold and have been put against someone's emissions are effectively kind of still there, because they'll be taken out of the kind of buffer pot. So there are various kind of practical things we can do when we're developing codes and kind of the market in general that can help with that kind of climate change risk.
And I would just add, in terms of kind of zooming out and NDCs, and specifically think about kind of warming events and rising ocean temperatures, the sort of modelling and the predictive modelling around emissions scenarios can be really useful to kind of look at adaptive measures and predicting certain species migration under different emission scenarios, monitoring migration patterns, etc., and then sort of predicting where marine protected areas could be in the future, or sort of climate refugia sort of areas. And then also, if we're thinking about COP28 in next week, the first global stocktake is taking place, and we really want to see kind of the ocean embedded more heavily in kind of adaptive and mitigation plans following the global stocktake, and sort of NDCs being updated to really think about how the ocean needs to be integrated within those plans for when the next global stocktake happens, and thinking about kind of that very question in terms of climate resilience and also climate risk when thinking about nature-based solutions. Yeah, thank you for sharing your report as well.
Can I add a sort of follow-on question from Bruce Howard, because it relates to this, and that's from a risk point of view. Do we think that carbon stored in marine habitats is more secure than that in terrestrial habitats, or less secure?
That's a really hard question to answer. It's so context specific. I wouldn't like to say either way. I think it totally depends. You could argue that coastal areas have got kind of more pressures on them in terms of like, you know, if the tide comes in, that's quite a big kind of erosion event that could happen. But that's not necessarily true. There's lots of pressures on peatlands and that as well, and things like the kind of woodlands, what happens to that wood once a tree falls down and you fell it, what happens to that wood? There's lots of kind of different parts to that puzzle, and I don't feel like I can really answer it, to be honest.
Taco or Maddie, anything to
Yeah.
add?
I know you mentioned the seabed in your question. There are so many unanswered questions about that. But Blue Marine are working on a 5-year science program at the moment to try and understand the role of continental seashelves on this kind of particular question, and the role within the carbon cycle. Where is the carbon? How much carbon is there? What have the anthropogenic impacts been on that carbon through destructive practices, or what the biodiversity is, and also sort of an education piece around what might the future of that look like, and how to kind of raise the importance of that. So that's just, yeah, one thing in terms of trying to help maybe answer a piece of that puzzle. But as Annette says, it's so context specific, it's quite hard to answer.
I've got a couple more sort of follow-on questions in Q&A on this topic, so I'll run with that. Let's run with that for a little bit. So a follow-on question from Sheila Heyman again is, there's basically an issue that some climate change issues cannot be managed away, and with progressive sea level rise, coastal squeeze, you may just lose habitat and there's nothing you can do about it. I know you partly answered that, Annette, in terms of assessing risk beforehand, but any other thoughts on that?
I mean, I guess within the kind of project design, so if you're designing a project and you want to enter it into the voluntary carbon market, and you are going to be selling credits, and you want to make sure that they are as resilient as possible, within the project design, you would have to create space for change to happen. So as sea levels rise, if a saltmarsh habitat has got room to kind of move inland, then the amount of habitat you lose isn't necessarily as much as you might think, or you might not actually lose any habitat because it would just kind of migrate. And it has been shown that salt marshes are very good at keeping up with sea level rise. They will move and migrate inland if they can. So yes, there are things that we can never fully predict or account for, but I think it all goes down to that project design and that whole thing about, it's not that every restoration project could enter the code, because you have to make sure that project design was as robust as possible.
Yep, thank you. Can insurance be a solution to addressing risk in these schemes? That's a question from Amy Alado Blake.
Yeah, I would think so. But not in the sense of insurance that you insure your project, but insurance as a funder of your products, because insurers obviously fund very specific risks, and they fund specific risks to the environment and to the marine environment, and therefore it would make complete sense if insurers would actually use the policy fee funds that they've received to invest into marine projects, to at least try to mitigate the risk for which they have just written an insurance. But for the rest, insurance just on your project level, I don't think the markets are advanced enough yet for the next 10 years to do that.
Thank you. So a question from Mel Parker. What's your honest feeling about whether the many complicated challenges identified can be overcome to establish a sustainable marine natural capital approach to marine resource management in the UK? And any idea of timescales? So open to anyone on the panel.
Well, I'll be the optimist. I think that all issues are out there on the table. I don't think there are many issues that haven't been, that are not known yet. So if you've got a set of problems on the table, and you've got, and obviously, Maddie and the team at Pollination Finance Earth are doing a great job at the moment of getting all stakeholders together. If you've got all the stakeholders together, you've got all the issues together, well, then you just need to set a deadline and say, you've got 1 year to come up with the first blueprint, how this works. And obviously realizing that there will be a version 2 and a version 3 of that blueprint, but it doesn't need to take long. We just need to work.
I would echo that, not just because it's our piece of work, but I definitely am optimistic, and the kind of enthusiasm and the engagement in this piece of work has been great. So it shows that there is an appetite for it. I think it's also could be a really good way to channel private and sort of link with public investment into the sector to achieve ultimate kind of conservation and restoration aims for our blue carbon ecosystems in the UK, but also general marine natural capital. And as Taco says, kind of acknowledging that there might be a second and a third and a fourth iteration of what that might look like, but having now kind of understood and mapped out all the barriers, and now working on really trying to hone in on what the key recommendations are, what the timeframes for those recommendations are, and who should be engaged in each stage of those recommendations, or lead on them, or whatever. But I think, yes, I remain optimistic.
Can I just add as well that yes, there's all these barriers and everything, but we don't necessarily have to overcome all of them before we can do some good. So it's not, it could be tackled in pieces, and something will be resolved, and you can move forward with that particular avenue, and still keep working on some of the other barriers. So it's not a kind of all or nothing. I don't feel anyway.
Thank you all. I'll go to the first question that came up in the Q&A, so I haven't forgotten it. What are the main challenges for these kind of schemes becoming commercially viable?
If you're talking purely the commercial side of it, so forgetting all the other questions, then I think, but I'm really not the expert, and Maddie may perhaps have a better overview of all the different things that you can do in the marine environment. There are very different economics involved, for instance, in the seagrass planting versus oyster restoration. That is just a fundamentally different set of activities and and things that you need to do, whether you buy a machine that hatches oysters and you put it in the water, or whether you need to go with a pincet, with a small machine and plant seagrass bits in the seabed, are just very different activities, and you just need to model each one. And I guess from our perspective, we have looked at seagrass and skipped it because we thought that was a lot harder commercially speaking than oysters, than oyster restoration. But we may be wrong on it. The markets will show in the end. And of course, the other point is that if seagrass restoration costs a lot, or some other thing costs a lot, well, then that's what society will have to pay, right? If the society destroyed it, well, then that's to pay the price for restoring it. I just need to find a buyer who agrees with that position.
I think I would add, and Annette, you can speak to it more specifically in terms of the code, but as you pointed out, the kind of existing methodologies and codes for VERF that are applicable to blue carbon ecosystems, and obviously we have a lack of mangroves in the UK, and so those kind of internationally applicable codes weren't commercially viable for our salt marsh habitat, which is why a domestic code is being developed. And so that is kind of one of the key barriers at the moment. And then the second is, often these projects need kind of that upfront, often philanthropic support at the beginning, which need a specific funder for that who would be willing to either maybe take that risk, as Annette already discussed, in terms of the pending issuance credits. They're often cheaper, but there's a greater risk, and so needing that kind of specific type of funder to support those early stage projects. And that's kind of applicable also internationally in the blue carbon market. It's not that the UK's marine natural capital market is so nascent compared to the rest of the world. Generally, the blue carbon market is nascent compared to the terrestrial market at the moment. So we're seeing that kind of upfront capital requirement as a barrier everywhere. Annette, I don't know if you wanted to add anything in terms of the code.
Kind of not really. With the salt marsh code, with what we've looked at so far, they would need a kind of blended approach to the finances. So having an operational or a operational grant or something like that goes alongside the carbon finance is the way that it would need to be done. But then again, we are looking at this kind of stacking or bundling of different units from different ecosystem services. So the more we know about that and the further we get along the line of being able to kind of quantify those kind of benefits as well, will again make the codes more commercially viable as well, being able to sell more units on the same piece of land. And then just in generally, the more we know, the kind of better the kind of forecasting and financial modelling can get. Things like you need to take into account things like what your MRV is going to cost and things. So the cheaper that is, the more models there are that can predict things. You don't actually have to go on the ground and measure absolutely every little bit of everything. Will make things, that component, cheaper, which then feeds into the financial model and everything as well. So I think a lot of this is just kind of like a time issue. As time goes on, we'll know more, and then I think these things will become more commercially viable more and more into the future.
Thank you. So a question from Joe Breen. Do the panel see a place for marine rewilding over large areas rather than site-specific small-scale restoration?
Yep. I would say there's a lot of interest now on kind of seascapes, so looking at multiple habitats within a location and restoring it as a whole rather than just looking at one bit, because it's all interconnected. So just looking at one site and one habitat in a way doesn't really make sense, and they could all kind of the sum of the parts would be greater than each one individually. So there is work on kind of that, more on that along those lines and that approach now happening, and I'm sure there will be a way forward with that in terms of being able to kind of market ecosystem services from it.
Anyone, Taco or Maddie, did you want to add to that?
Nothing to add.
Okay, so other question from, oh, sorry, Maddie, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Blue is working on exactly what Annette just mentioned in terms of the seascape scale restoration. We have a flagship project in the Solent alongside 10 other partners looking at salt marsh, seagrass, oysters and seabird nesting sites being restored simultaneously. Over the project has funding for the next 5 years. We've just finished, I think, year 1, and exactly kind of looking at that, what is the sort of biodiversity uplift over those 5 years of looking at those habitats simultaneously. And something that I didn't mention the scope of my presentation was we're working with Plan Vivo to look at biodiversity credits and ensuring that kind of marine biodiversity credits are sort of developed alongside terrestrial credits, which is very exciting. And so if anyone, it's sort of a whole nother topic, but if anyone is interested, I can put you in touch with my colleague who's leading on it.
Thank you. We've probably got time for one more question. So another question from Kerry Whalen. So she's curious about the Crown Estate's position in relation to all of these activities and ideas. So I guess from your experience of working with them, do they have a particular vision or concerns that they focus on, or do they help connect different projects? What's your kind of view of perhaps their current role and perhaps what that role could be?
In terms of the work that we are undertaking at the moment, it's been sort of fully collaborative effort. At the beginning, it was Blue and the Crown Estate, and now in phase 2, the Crown Estate Scotland has joined, which is great, and it's been fully collaborative. I probably can't speak specifically to their kind of priorities in terms of, I can't speak for them, but it's been. They've been super engaged. Caroline Price is leading it from their side, and acknowledging that marine spatial planning and marine licensing needs to be fully kind of embedded in this process to support projects, and sort of how can that work for marine natural capital projects alongside all of the other marine uses that the Crown Estate has to think about, offshore wind, etc., and how that can interact with marine natural capital. So they're, in my mind, kind of the most important stakeholder in all of this, because of the different sort of complexities and different licenses that they have to manage. And so it's great that we've been working on this with them.